Okay, welcome committee members. This is the Education, Health, and Environmental Committee. Welcome guests and welcome public. This is being live streamed on YouTube. This afternoon's briefing is by the State Board of Elections with the hope of informing the committee and the public of what transpired during the primary and the general election. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and the other purpose is to give us as much information that will inform us for any legislation that'll be coming in front of the committee. And I know there will be a number of pieces of legislation. I know the Vice Chairman has a number. I know, I believe Senator Washington may have some. Senator Kramer will probably have many, many pieces. I have one. So our hope is to understand what went right, what suggested changes, and probably some slicing and dicing of who voted where and when and in what form. So that being said, I want to welcome the director and her staff. There are a number of you on the call, so I won't try to name all of you, but let's turn it over to the State Board of Elections. If we can unmute Ms. Lamone. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be before you today. First, I'd like to introduce the State Board of Elections staff that are participating in the briefing today. And we also have a PowerPoint presentation. And if your staff could put that up, that would be great for you all to see. Nikki Charleston is our deputy. She will be helping out today. Donna Duncan, Assistant Deputy for Election Policy. Jared DeMarinis, Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance, and one of our legislative liaisons. Mary Kramer Wagner, Director of Voter Registration and Petitions, and our other legislative liaison. Excuse me. The 2020 general election overview. We have a slide here. The turnout. We had almost 75% of eligible voters vote, was the highest turnout since the 2008 general election. How voters voted was very different than in prior elections. About 50% of our voters voted by mail and 50% voted in person. You can see all of that on our slide. Next slide, please. This has statistics on in-person voting. This is the first election where more voters voted during early voting than on election day. In prior elections, we had 25 to 30% of voters who cast their ballots during early voting. The busiest days, as you can see, were the first and the third day. In prior elections, the busiest 2 days were the last 2 days, with day 2 close behind. And next slide, please.
Linda, let's go back. A number of us didn't have the slides in front of us.
Right.
So let's go back to your first slide. Okay.
Okay. There you go. That has the voter turnout statistics. You can see that we had 4.1 million voters were eligible. Almost 75% of them participated. Almost 50% of them voted and returned a mail-in ballot, and the other half voted in person. So it was a very impressive. When we'll discuss how we got the voters to get there in a minute. Could I have the next slide then, please? This is our in-person voting statistics. More people voted early voting than on election day. In prior elections, about 25 to 30% of voters who voted cast their ballots during early voting. As you can see, the busiest days were the first and the second, and the third, sorry. Usually it's the last couple of days that are the busiest days. Next slide, please. Voter voters in this election had very different voting patterns, but that's what we asked them to do. We asked them to vote by mail as it was the safest way to vote in a pandemic. We asked them to vote early if they preferred or needed to vote in person, and they listened to our message. As you can see, then could I have the next slide, please? So the next slide is dealing with the mail-in voting. So mail-in voting, as I previously stated, almost 50% of our voters voted a mail-in ballot. Almost 89% of the voters who requested a mail-in ballot returned it. This is the highest rate of return since the 28 general election. More mail-in ballots were counted as a raw number and as a percentage in this election than in any other election since we've been keeping this type of data.
Linda,
Yes.
if we could, we had some problem unmuting me. Go back to the early voting, please.
Okay.
You said, I think, was 32% figure you used, 32% of the 50% or 32% of all the votes?
Of all the votes. Well, I got to find my,
So in other words, I think you said that 50% were mailed in and 50% were walk-up.
correct. That's correct.
So 32% of the 50%, I'm sorry, 32% of all votes. So that means 18% voted on election day.
Nikki, do you have that in front of you? Could you unmute Nikki, please?
Okay, so if I can just summarize, I want us to understand 50% mailed in, 32% went early,
Correct.
14% voted on election day, and 3% were provisional.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, I just want us to understand this. Please.
Okay. All right. Okay. So could we go to the slide? Don't think we've gone over this yet, is the mail-in voting. There we go. So as I said previously, almost 50% of people voted a mail-in ballot, and 89% of them who requested a mail-in ballot returned it. And that is that's the highest we've ever had. And more mail-in ballots were counted as a raw number and as percentage in this election than in any other election. Next slide, please. Same day registration. As you can see, we had.
Linda, I don't want to keep interrupting you, but there are some questions of clarity. So Senator Riley, I believe you have a question about one of the slides and a clarity question. Can you unmute or Lamar, would you unmute? Senator?
Got it. I have it. Linda, do you have these same statistics for the primaries?
We do. I don't have them in front of me, but we can.
That's fine. That's fine. Would you provide the committee with all of the statistics just like this for the early voting? And then if you'll go back 2 slides, you indicated the number of people who voted by mail, the number of people who voted in person. It was 40, right there. No, go back. Right there.
Yeah.
We're missing 0.3% of the voters. Where are they? $49.8 plus 49 point. Is it a rounding error?
Well, we had provisional ballots too.
But wouldn't I presume provisionals are included in person? I mean, I think the math adds up when you do 1.528 thousand, million, 0.5 plus 1.5 give you the 3 million, but your percentages are off. So I just saying the math add up. So,
Let's assuming it's a rounding error for now, and she'll get back to us.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if you can get us the primary, and also can we get a copy of this PowerPoint sent to us, please?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Okay,
All right.
Please continue, Ms. Lamone.
Thank you. I think we're at the slide that is same-day registration and address changes. Yeah. So this was the first year that we had same-day registration during on election day. And as you can see, we had almost 14,000 people register on election day, and we had 7,000 people update their addresses during early voting. So that was impressive as well. The voters obviously really liked it. Could I have the next slide, please? And I need to have you unmute Nikki. She's going to be making this presentation.
Good afternoon, Nikki Charlson. So thank you I'm going to just talk a little bit about the voter education campaign that we launched. This was about a 3.5-month campaign. And on the screen are just some highlights of some of the usage of sort of the outcomes of that. It included both the digital campaign as well as the traditional campaign of TV, radio, and print. It was statewide and was targeting all counties, all populations. We had an active Spanish-speaking campaign, which was led by Gilberto Zelaya of the Montgomery County Board of Elections. And so a big shout out to him. We did have some other support in the Hispanic community, but Gilberto really took the lead and was our spokesperson in those media markets. And we're grateful for his help. But it was a widespread campaign supported by a large team that did all of the graphic work. The media buys was the most of the money spent on it. And then we also did lots of press releases that generated over 1,400 articles. And if you could advance to the next slide too, it also included grassroots and community campaigns. We engaged over 1,900.
Next slide, please, Lemoria.
We engaged, thank you, over 1,900 businesses, civic groups, community, any group that asked for information or we found, we included them in sharing, in messaging, in all the icons that you've actually seen throughout this presentation. And we also shared them with all of you. And so to those of you that took the icons and the messages and distributed them to your constituents, we are grateful for your help and partnership in this effort. And then we also participated in any event where someone would have us come. These were obviously all virtual, but we participated in over 25 community events, town halls, webinars. So town halls sponsored by small groups, town halls sponsored by media stations, the news stations, radio stations, wherever we were asked to go, we did. And it seemed like it was, the people were very receptive to receiving the information. And obviously as we started, there were more unknowns, but as we moved closer to the election, we were able to provide very specific information about the election. Next slide, please. So one of the things we looked at is we took all of the key messages from the campaign and then looked to see what the data showed to see if those messages were effective. And by effective, did voters listen? And did voters maybe change their behavior based on the message? And based on the data that Linda's already presented, it became very clear that voters did things differently this time, which reinforced our goal with the messages. So we were promoting vote by mail as the safest way to vote. Almost 50% of our voters decided to vote that way. we really pushed hard to remind voters to return their voted ballots. And we had a very high return rate in this election. We talked a lot about using the ballot drop-off box, which, as Donna likes to say, that image is the image of this year. Voters really responded, and I think with the issues with the post office aligning at the same time as the election, it provided a very effective way for voters to return their ballots and be confident that it was in the hands of the local board of elections, just at the drop-off box. So we had over 1 million voters return their ballots at those boxes. And then we knew that there were going to be voters who either preferred or needed to vote in person. There will always be voters who want or need that way to vote. And so when we talked about in-person voting, we talked about it in the sense of, if you're going to vote in person, make a plan to vote early so that you have more options if something comes up on that day and you can't vote. And as Linda showed on the bar graph earlier, voters came the first 3 days. The first 2 were the busiest, but the first 3 days, and then it sort of petered off. Now those days are different than we're used to. We've never had early voting on the weekend before the election, and we weren't sure how that was going to play out. But there weren't a huge amount of voters on the weekend before the election day or the day before. But that shows that voters were listening to the message that we were putting out about, if you're going to vote in person, vote early. And so those were the 4 key messages. We had lots of other messages. We had lots of just static messages where it was just pushed out, push the date of the voter registration deadline, push the date to request a ballot, push the deadlines. Those were just static messages just to inform voters so that they were aware. But these were the four key messages that we had. And I think the data shows that they were well received by voters. We do have a full report. It's very long on our website, and we're happy to, I can provide it to the committee, council, and staff, so you all can have that if you'd like to see that. And then, of course, all of this effort was supported by the usual outreach that the state and local election officials do all the time. So we all have social media accounts that we push. We all have our own media contacts. So we were supplementing this very coordinated statewide effort and integrating the messages of that state campaign and the images into our work. So on our platforms alone, we had 4 million views and lots of activity on Facebook and Twitter. So it was more than just the paid campaign. Each of the election officials were also doing their own part to reinforce the message and reach voters that maybe weren't being reached through the other media. So with that, I will turn it back to Linda to the next slide, please.
So as far as our election judges and volunteers, we had a tremendous outpouring of voters who had expressed an interest in serving as an election judge. It was really impressive. It meant that the local boards, once we figured out how the election was going to be conducted, had sufficient judges to run all of the early voting centers and election day vote centers, in addition to having a bench of people that they could call on. And we hope that all of these folks remain as enthusiastic for your election in 2022. We also reached out and worked with the Department of Health Medical Reserve Corps, and they provided what they call health ambassadors in a number of counties. And they distributed face masks and hand sanitizers. They sanitized the surfaces, provided information to the voters on the good health practices, and helped maintain the 6-foot social distancing while the folks were waiting in line. It was a tremendous effort, and I really was impressed at their enthusiasm and the amount of help that they gave. Along those same lines, I would like to give special thanks to a number of people and organizations that really stepped up to the plate for November. Of course, it goes without saying that a big shout out to Governor Hogan for his assistance in recruiting election judges and providing us with what flexibility we needed through various executive orders. The Motor Vehicle Administration was just tremendous in setting up a data processing center in Glen Burnie so that we could help the local boards process the influx of mail-in ballot applications. The Department of Budget and Management Office of Personnel Services and Benefits for their assistance in recruiting and staffing the data center. The University of Maryland Global Campus agreed to and was ready to have a standby data process. We needed it. The Maryland Emergency Management Agency and the Maryland Center for Analysis and Coordination for their briefing and sharing of information. As I said, the Maryland Department of Health for their very sage advice and guidance throughout last year's election, and their partnership in deploying our health ambassadors. Our state and local election officials who work tirelessly, I can't tell you how tirelessly, to conduct this election, and they deserve more credit than they'll ever receive, and I am grateful and proud to work with them. And the voters, they were patient, they were kind, they were enthusiastic. It was really fascinating to watch. It was a happy election. So, future elections, we have a couple of slides. If you could move forward, please. So if we move to an election day vote center, we need to do a number of things. We need to analyze the number and placement of the centers. We need to review the types of facilities that worked well and identify the preferred features of them. If we send eligible voters applications to request a mail-in ballot, we obviously need to establish data processing centers to process the request and take some of the burden off the local boards of elections. One of the things we did this year was we expanded the use of sending emails to the voters on the status of their mail-in ballots, and the voters loved it. We'd send them one that say, your ballot's been received. We'd send another one and say, your ballot's been counted. We received lots of compliments on that, and we really want to expand on doing that and have a greater ability and have more email addresses. Next slide, please. We want to continue the use of the drop-off boxes. As you heard earlier, the voters really love them, but we need to have a little more data analysis to identify the best locations for the boxes. And we need to consider what resources there are to secure and manage them. As you may know, a lot of the counties stepped up with county resources to help the local boards secure and manage the boxes. And we're not sure if that level of support will always be available. We need to continue to have a statewide voter education campaign to educate the voters about the process that they're going to be using. And if the percentage of voters who vote by mail equals or exceeds 50%, we need to analyze the processes and explore technologies to help the local boards manage those ballots. Could I have the next slide, please? So, what are our activities in 2021? If you could turn on Jared's microphone, please. He'd like to explain what's going on in the area of campaign finance.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you to the committee. Just wanted to make note that the fundraising prohibition has commenced. So please, members, you're prohibited from soliciting contributions for federal, state, and local candidates, and to take down any contribution links you have on your websites or social media accounts. Make sure that they're not active. Reports. The 2021 annual report is due on January 20th, and that is the report for the entire year. The 2020 campaign finance reports will be audited later this year from the campaign account. So if you participated in the Baltimore City election year, most likely you'll then had any deficiencies, you will be getting a notice from us to amend those reports later on in the year. Public financing, the county public financing programs are are being expanded this year. 2022 will be the first year for Howard County elections to participate with the public financing. The Candidacy and Campaign Finance Division is working with Howard County to develop county regulations and rules for the program. Additionally, the division is working with Montgomery County on developing a comprehensive audit plan for their county and making sure that they're compliant with the laws. On the state public financing, the seed money contributions for collection can start on March 1st of this year. Currently, the fund has a little over $3.6 million in it. This would make it insufficient to fully fund one candidate for both the 2022 primary and general elections. So unless something is done with the formula, or the program would not be able to sufficiently fund both the primary and the general. On enforcement actions, the division collected over $89,000 in late fees in 2020 and over $15,225 in civil penalties, and this excludes any fines or penalties collected by the Office of the State Prosecutor based upon division referrals. We still have an additional $5,000 in pending collection as well. And to let you know, the maximum civil penalty that the State Board can levy is $500. We received over 90 complaints to investigate in 2020 and issued over 80 civil citation or settlement agreements, and as well as conducted numerous audits and reconciliations with committees. For candidacy, the candidate filings for the 2022 gubernatorial election year starts on February 23rd. We are currently developing an appointment system to handle in-person filings. Candidates will be, so we're working out the details now for that. Candidates that file will receive a notice that redistricting may change the district that they are filed, what office they filed for, and SBE will automatically move the candidate into the correct district once the plans are finalized by the General Assembly. With that, that's the candidacy.
Thank you, Jared. So we have a couple of projects we want to mention to you that we'll be doing next year, or this year, actually, sorry. Of course, one of the big ones is implementing the changes, the redistricting and reapportionment. And just everybody needs to keep in mind that we need the final plans in place as soon as possible because the ballot preparation starts early March 2022. Our big project is we're replacing the electronic poll books. It's going to be a statewide implementation to replace the poll books that are now 15 years plus. The procurement has started and the proposals from bidders are due January the 25th. We have been providing the joint chairman quarterly updates on this project as required by the joint chairman report adopted last session. We've got a couple pieces of legislation that will be pending before you guys. One is a bill that amends the election calendar to align certain deadlines with the ballot printing schedule in the gubernatorial elections. Another one is, thanks to Senator Simon Ayer, to protect contributor information from unsavory use. We have a departmental bill that removes a subjective provision of the law on when a committee must file a final report. Another one is to increase the statute of limitations from 3 to 4 years on election law violations, increasing the enforcement authority of the state board to include the Public Financing Act, and lastly, allowing the state prosecutor to issue civil citation for Title 14 late filings, and that Title 14 is deals with persons doing public business with the state. And that's all we have in our formal presentation, Mr. Chairman. We are happy to answer any questions, and I would ask the administrator if she would make sure that both Nikki and I are turned on to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lamone. Members, please click on participants and raise your hand. So I'll have knowledge of that. Hopefully it's now working for everyone. If not, either text me or raise your hand. Senator Riley, do you have another question or is this from last time?
Paul, I have about 7 questions and I would like other members to go first. I don't want to dominate, so just come back to me later.
Thank you. I have you down. Other members? I have some as well, but I'm going to hold. Don't be bashful. I know my committee is not bashful. Okay, Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Down.
I just had a question, probably for Jared, clarification on where candidates, as far as where they live and what they'll be potentially running for, what seat, what district. I thought at the hearing last year, they more or less said that if you filed for an office, and then the line was different, you had to move to that district 6 months prior to when you would actually take office. So now they're saying that they will automatically switch you to the district you now live in if the lines change. That's a change.
Jared? You're muted.
I think he might need to be unmuted if that's possible.
Please unmute Mr. Damaris, please.
So Senator, if you walk in and you filed for, say, a district, but then the lines were shifted, we would move you into the correct district in which you were eligible to run for.
So you don't have to move.
Right.
We'll move you. We'll move the district number.
Right, but this is
Right.
going to happen after the filing deadline's done, right?
Yes.
Yes.
It happens every time we reapportion the general assemblies. We have to adjust it. So if you filed to run in District 1 and all of a sudden you found out that you're really in District 2, we would assign you to District 2.
Okay.
Because you're not eligible to run in the other district.
Now you can move if you want.
Right.
Okay, I know the everything's a little different now. 20 years ago is when there would have been a similar case when you have this line up as far as a timeline, but 20 years ago, the primaries were in September.
Right.
Yes.
So this is the first time doing this, and that's, I've been calling attention to this for a while. I think, man, this could make for some interesting time here coming up.
Right.
And potentially, you don't even know what the map is and you have to file for an office.
Right.
Yes.
That is correct. Yeah.
That is I'll just leave it at that.
And
Thank you.
Senator Kagan, I'm going to slip in a follow-up question before I call on you next. Following up on what Senator Gallion said, what is the last available date that the redistricting can happen that you can run a successful election? Obviously, we start with the primary, and as Senator Gallion said, it's earlier. And I know we don't get the census data, I think, until April. So in terms of not just shifting candidates, but running new runs for where people vote and who the representative is, how long do you need working backwards?
Well, we need to start the ballot prep in March of 2022. The election is June the 28th, with of course early voting starting whenever you all determine, but 2 weeks before that. And then we have the 45-day deadline for our overseas and military voters, 45 days prior to June 28th.
So March 22nd of 2022 is the latest you can have. And what about notifying voters of their new districts? Is that separate from ballot prep, or is that one and the same?
It's separate.
Well, do you need more time or less time in terms of notifying voters if they're in a new district?
I'd have to go, I have to get back to you on that. We're working on the calendar now. Part of the complicating factor is under federal law, we're precluded from doing certain things with voter registration after a certain date. And I don't know without having a calendar in front of me when that is.
Okay.
But Senator, we can get that to you.
That's fine, because obviously it has implications for the redistricting efforts of the General Assembly. Senator Kagan, please unmute her.
I'm unmuted, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I have 3 questions, and Senator Riley, I don't know whether we'll be doing the Vulcan mind meld and have some of the same thoughts, but one of my 3 was exactly where Senator Gallion was going, I think. So I'll just start by continuing with him. There are some candidates who choose to run for office because they think that there's, let's say, an incumbent who's not doing a good job. And just because the lines move, they still may want to choose to run in that old district. So doing something automatically without notifying a candidate is something I think I'd like to learn more about the wisdom of that. Because as Linda Lamone just said, there may be some people who say, forget it, then I will move. There is also a period of time before which you have to be living in your district. So I think we ought to find out about that. But the idea that somebody's automatically moved into a district just because the lines changed, I think we should reconsider and discuss. My second question, Linda, Nikki, I didn't hear any reference, and I didn't see on the slides, the question of internet delivered ballots. 9.7%, I believe, 163,907 is the data that we have, were requested by that they be delivered a link through email, which was much harder for our local boards of elections and much harder for our voters. A lot of voters didn't understand that. They then showed up, and that was the bulk, from what I understand, of our provisional voters, because it was too hard to find a printer. They didn't have a working printer, or find an envelope, or pay for a stamp and all that. So they then showed up and then were told that they had to vote provisionally. So can you speak to internet delivered ballot? And then I have one more question.
Sure, that's Nikki. I'm happy to take that question. So yeah, so we had a little less than 10% of our voters who asked to vote by mail, or asked for a mail-in ballot, asked for electronic delivery. And so that the message changed, and the percentage did decrease, but it was a large number. I think your comments about most of the provisionals were voters who were electronic delivery. We don't have data for that. We don't capture that. The only data that we capture is what percentage of provisional voters got a provisional ballot because they were flagged as having already received a ballot. So that would include all vote by mail ballots, whether they were delivered by mail or delivered electronically. And I think that is in fact the case. I think that voters thought they would get vote by mail and then changed their mind. And that's exactly what the provisional process is for. But I don't know how that, we don't capture how it breaks down between voters who were electronic or by mail. So yeah, that's certainly electronic delivery is an option that is available to voters. It does require some duplication effort on the back end by the local boards of elections. But again, it's for the voters to decide what works best. And if that's how they wanted to receive delivery, then we certainly provided them with that ballot. If I may just add one more thing, in the application process, whether they use the paper form or use the electronic form, it does talk to them about, it does provide information about what electronic ballot delivery means, that someone's going to have to duplicate that ballot, that you're going to use the internet to obtain your ballot. And so we try to front load some of the information so voters have as much information about that delivery method when they make the request as they need.
So thank you for that, Nikki. I think that information got out late, as you said, as that messaging changed, and I think it was done differently at the local level. And so it's something that we aren't going to get deeply into today, but I think it's something worth discussing. My other question, and it's one that I'm sure my colleagues also heard a lot about. We also heard questions at the national level when we're talking about accuracy of our voter database. Now, Maryland was a founding member of ERIC, the Electronic Resource Information Center, I think it's called, which maintains voter databases. And if someone moves out of state or dies, then then we get information about that to make sure that that a ballot is not sent to them. I think all of us heard from constituents who had someone whose child moved out of the house 10 years earlier, but they were sent a ballot, or someone who died or moved or something, and they still got a ballot. Can you talk about how we use ERIC, how the local boards of elections use ERIC to maintain our databases, and if there are thoughts or plans for modification of that in the future?
Can you please unmute Mary Kramer Wagner? She's our voter registration manager.
Thank you, Mary.
Hi, good afternoon, Senator. Yes, we have the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC, and we use all of the reports and we follow federal guidelines. So when you say, we have to send out confirmation mailings to these individuals, and we really do hope that these individuals respond to these mailings to say, yes, Senator Kagan no longer lives at this address and I am now in Colorado. And then if they don't respond, then they go into, again, an inactive situation. So ERIC is very key to keeping Maryland's list maintenance process clean. I'm very proud of Maryland being one of the first states to be an ERIC participant. So I don't know if I answered all your questions, Senator, but I'll be more than happy to meet with you.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is something the committee will want to continue to discuss, but not today. Mary, I'm happy to have a conversation. I talked to a Senate colleague not on this committee who told me that their son had moved out of state more than a decade ago, and they still get materials. And I venture to say that the average Marylander is not going to respond to a mailing like that. They'll just rip it up because that person isn't living here anymore. So I do think we want to be able to reassure everybody of the quality of our database. So we'll talk about that offline if we could, Mary.
With all due respect, Senator, if we don't know that somebody's moved or unfortunately passed away, we can't just remove people from the list based on a rumor. We have to have proof.
So we join ERIC, and that's why we paid dues. And the ERIC does use Social Security information. They do homework. They work with all MVAs. When people register in one of the 29 other states or the District of Columbia, they are supposed to then be unregistered in Maryland when they re-register in a participating state. That is all supposed to work, and it hasn't. I've spoken to the CEO of ERIC a couple of times and have been sending him some of the examples that I have so he could look into it and figure out why it is that the system did not work. We pay for.
We're going to have to continue this offline.
Absolutely.
We set aside an hour for this, and we have another hearing, and I don't want to keep those people waiting too long.
Yep.
Thank
you, Mr. Chairman.
The environment. Senator Simon Ayer. Please unmute Senator Simon Ayer or unmute yourself. I don't know if you
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. Just a couple quick questions. I know it was deemed as a successful election, the general election. We had two styles of election. One was the primary, one was the general. In the primary, they sent out all ballots, and the second in the general was the ballot application. I know there were calls in the general to also send out just the ballots and not the application. And we could go over details like it's been brought up already as far as people receiving ballots that weren't theirs, or hundreds of thousands, probably millions that weren't used. So three quick questions. One is, Mary just brought this up. Are the inactive, as you call them, inactive situations, are they mailed ballots like in the primary this year, last year?
They were not mailed ballots in the primary, and we did not mail them applications either.
Okay. And then the second thing is, we talk about expanded access versus safeguards, and I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think we can actually do both. But the situation I'd like to know is if someone receives a ballot and an incorrect person sends it back, and a person then shows up for in-day voting or in-person voting, what happens to that vote of the person who really was supposed to vote, but the other vote came in and they canvassed it?
So thank you for the question. So we have had for years in place procedures for what the local election officials do when they receive, or it appears that one voter has multiple voting credits. So in your example, the voter would have a provisional, a provisional credit and a mail-in credit, right? So those reports we provide before they start counting those mail-in ballots, so they can pull them and do the required research. And so that includes pulling all of the documents associated with those two ballots and making a determination as to whether the same person voted both ballots. So in your example, it would be the provisional ballot that would count because the person did not vote the mail-in ballot. It does happen through just election judges checking in a father, a junior, senior, and then the other one shows up. So it is a process that is used in every election. But in your case, it would be the provisional that would count because that data would match up with the documents would match up with the voter's voter record, and the mail-in would be rejected. And then that would be something that we would forward to the Office of State Prosecutor for further review.
So if it was canvassed already, the provisional would not be counted. Is that correct?
So in this case, right. So that's a good distinction. When we started counting ballots before election day, the provisional would count, and we would then again refer the individual or the information and document about the vote by mail ballot to the Office of the State Prosecutor.
You say the provisional wouldn't? So if the mail-in ballot came in and you already canvassed it, you're saying the provisional ballot would count?
That would, because that was the legitimately cast ballot by that voter.
Okay, and maybe we can get offline on that, but I thought we can talk more about that. But also, just following up on that, I was pretty sure in past sessions, there is a law that says if you have duplicate votes, you cannot count either votes.
No.
You're saying that they are just making that judgment on their own, opposed to what?
You can't, it doesn't matter.
No, there's a policy on that.
No, I don't believe so. And you can correct me. I believe we had a meeting 2 years ago about this, where actually the law says if there are duplicates that you can't count either.
And that's correct. But in light of the changes to the election and the volume of ballots by mail, the decision to start counting ballots before election day required a change to that policy. And so we adopted, or the State Board of Elections adopted, emergency regulations that were in place just for this election. So you're right. The conversation we had a couple of years ago, that's the permanent policy. That's the policy that's in effect now, because the emergency regulations expired at the end of December. So we did have a slightly different policy. We had a different policy in place for this election because of the differences that were put in.
Gotcha. And then just one last question. Given the time, I'll hold off on that and we can talk offline. Thank you.
Okay, before I call on Senator Riley, I want to follow up on an earlier comment he raised. I think we would like the statistics for the general as well as the primary, but if possible, I think we'd also like it by jurisdiction. So in other words, I don't know if you have that available. I don't know if it's going to take a little time to put together, but I think we'd like to know whether the mail-in ballots was similar in Anne Arundel or Montgomery or Baltimore City. So I think that would be helpful for both the primary and general if we had it also broken down by the 24 jurisdictions. So
Absolutely.
now we understand that, but I think that would be very helpful to us in looking at other legislation that's going to come across our desk. Senator Riley.
Thank you very much. First, Attagirl, Mrs. Lamone, the email follow-up that you received the ballot, and then secondly, that you counted the ballot gave me a great deal of satisfaction. That was a great innovation. And also starting the early counting was critical when you look at the other states and the problems and the had. our early count, although it creates other problems, I think was a very, very good thing to do. My first question is, on your slide that said election judges, you indicate there was 96 election day voting centers in 6 jurisdictions. Why only 6? Why wasn't there an early voting center in every jurisdiction?
Let me get to that, Senator Riley. I think what you're looking at is the,
Well, it was election judges at the time.
no, there were voting centers everywhere, but the health ambassadors were only at a limited number of,
Yeah, I think that was a misleading, I think that was a misleading slide, Senator.
Okay, that's fine. That's good. Okay.
Right.
Number 2, a lot of states were criticized because of automated signature matching or no signature matching. My question is, I don't know the answer. Do we do actual signature matching of mail-in ballots?
No.
No. All right. And then bear with me just a second. There was a lot of criticism of the State Board of Elections about the delay in mailing out, whether it was the applications or the actual ballots. Would you address the committee on that issue, please?
I
I
think,
think it was the primary, usually.
but it was a primary.
Yeah, could you
Yeah.
address the committee on that?
Um,
What happened and what's the resolution?
well, the resolution, we got a new mail house. The problem for the primary was for mainly one jurisdiction, Baltimore City. And they got behind, the mail house / printer got behind, and they didn't mail out the ballots when they told us they had done it. And by the time we discovered it, almost a week had gone by. And so the ballots were late getting to the voters, some of the voters in Baltimore City. There was a smattering of that issue, same issue in Montgomery County.
And we had some in Anne Arundel too.
Some, yes. So we did not, we put out an RFP, got a new mail house / printer, and used that company for November, and they did a fabulous job.
Very good. One last question, Mr. Chair, from Mr. Damaris, my friend from Rolling Knolls.
Yes.
We were talking about the timing of the redistricting and the application for office. We had a brief discussion on someone moving. I have a single family house and I want to move to my new district due to redistricting. It's 60 or 90 days. Just want to verify that we have to be a resident of our new district at least 6 months in advance.
Yes, from the actual general election.
Right. Okay. So we may not be in our new district at the primary.
You would be, because it would be May. You would be moving in that district in May.
But if I don't get to move to my new house till June, then I'm disqualified?
Well, then you wouldn't meet the 6 months minimum requirements.
Yeah, it's problematic, Mr.
Yes.
I think it's a subject for negotiation and discussion. And
Right.
thank you for your patience. Some of the other members did a great job on my questions. Thank you.
And Senator, in the past, we've asked the Court of Appeals to modify that residency date by court order to give some flexibility, especially in a year like this, which we had 20 years ago.
And what did the court say?
I don't remember. Well, I'll try to dig it up and get the language, but it was to address the issue that you and several of your colleagues are concerned about.
And I presume they didn't change the 6-month residency.
They did. My recollection is they did, but let me check it.
Well, provide us the information, please.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Senator Washington. It's 1:56. The next hearing's at 2. I told them to warn people we'll be 5 or 10 minutes late. So let's assume we have about 10 more minutes for questions. Look, we underestimated the time. We may need to have a second hearing or briefing. Senator Washington.
I'm happy to hear that. Thank you. Because this topic of timing, this wasn't what I was going to ask, but I'm raising this now, and it's something we should explore, and if maybe the board has recommendations. Given all of the changes that we're making to the very foundation of structure and the way we're doing, should we evaluate the timelines of when we're having our primaries and then setting benchmarks about when certain things have to be done from a management perspective? So there's printing and things that you have to do on your side, and then will certainly have to be with looking at line drawing and candidates filing and all that on our side. So, this is not, an isn't it so? It really is. Should we look at the timeline and the dates that are currently in code and look at changing them or adjusting them to allow, for example, for there to be a canvas. So if if we're opening ballots, there's a difference between opening them and counting them. So we might want to open ballots because we're getting all these mail-in ballots, but we want to make sure that you have enough time to check with provisional ballots versus a ballot that may have been submitted, erroneously, or maybe I voted and I forgot. It was so long, maybe someone voted, they filled it out, and then they showed up on election day because there was all this hype. So, being able to check on both ends is really important.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah,
I would say, Chair, and to our committee, I do think this is something we need to look at because, yeah, we want to make sure that ERIC number and the database is right. But on the other, we also have another opportunity to check by making sure we have enough time to actually evaluate what's coming in. And that's where it seemed like that got crunched.
Yeah, and in response, we changed the way we did an election 3 times last year. In February, we had a traditional election, and then we went to a different one for the congressional general, and then we went to a different model, and then yet changed it again for November. And all in all, I think it worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
A lot of lessons learned, a lot of hand wringing. And we are also working on the calendar for the 2022 election and trying to work back from the primary to see how much time we have to do everything and accommodate you all as well. So
do you do that in the board? Like when would we have an opportunity to have this dialogue with you, or we make policy decisions about what that might look like? How do you make those decisions?
well, we're pretty much.
I'm going to interrupt.
Sorry. Yeah.
The more I listen, the more we're going to need another briefing to answer some of these very questions. The redistricting, the date, the residency, a number of these questions. And so I might want to wait 3 or 4 weeks, give the SBE some time to think about this, come up with the calendars, and rebrief us. I've also learned that technologically we can't announce to the people who are waiting while we're still on. So that being said, Senator Washington, if you have one quick one left, I'll let that go, and then we'll adjourn, and people probably need 5 minutes to stretch or maybe take care of private needs.
I will turn over the balance of my time. Thank you so much. We've got a lot of work.
Thank you. Yes. Look, we're learning as we're going. We probably have more questions. I think we can fill up another hour very easily. Let me thank SBE, Ms. Lamone, everyone else. And I'm going to speak for myself, not for the committee, but I think SBE did a yeoman's job making those 3 changes in consecutive months. So I think we're all very pleased. Again, it doesn't mean we don't need to make changes going forward, but you were dealt a pretty tough deck of cards, and you came out of it very well. So with that, I'm going to close this briefing. We'll schedule another one. We'll have Ms. Goodman look at that, and then we will reconvene in about 5 minutes on a different Zoom link. I want to remind you, it's a different Zoom link. Okay, thank all of you again. Thank you.
Thank you.